Hello, students. So, continuing what we've been doing, we are now going to look at sort of some thinkings on yoga, mostly in the 19th century. Because what is all of this class but a history of East and West, how this thing called yoga actually unites so much of culture. And while I keep talking about disruptions and saying yoga in the West is not like yoga in the East in the West, and West in the East, blah, 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 we're saying, in the words of Salman Rushdie, I won't choose East and West. East and West, people say never the twain shall they meet. But in fact, East and West are always imbued with one another and are mutually constituting one another. So with that note, let's get on with it. Okay, and I think I got my subtitles working this time because they weren't working last time. All right, so today we're going to be talking about philosophers and we're going to be talking about occultists. So what's the agenda? First thing I'm going to talk about what is enlightenment in the West. And I don't mean enlightenment like I've been talking about amongst yogis and yoga practitioners. Then we're going to be talking about Hegel, the great philosopher Hegel. What were the other philosophers, particularly all those Germans, doing with yoga and Sanskrit literature? Then we're going to look at Rajendralal Mitra's take on the Yogasutras, which I think is probably the best rendition of the Yogasutras I've ever seen. And then finally, we'll talk about the Theosophical Society. We're roughly covering the 3 chapters of White you had to read for today. So, Western terms. So we have this idea of the Enlightenment in the West. And I remember a friend of mine turning to me at one point and saying, you know, and he was a graduate student in English. He said, so much of how we think about the world is about the Enlightenment. So what is the Enlightenment? So the Western world is thought to be post-Enlightenment at this point. We're still very much doing the Enlightenment characteristic of thinking, of knowledge, of culture. So the Enlightenment is characterized by Protestant religion and Protestant suppositions. In particular, they talk about a rationalized version of religion and science somehow together, or religion and logic together. There is materialism. Only the world around us is real, the material world. There's a rejection of superstition. The world has been disenchanted. We look at the world as operating on science and physics principles, not by being dictated by the wills of gods or the spirits and forces, except in reality, a lot of us still do think that way and probably always have. Anyway, so the scientific method becomes our 10 commandments. We look to understand the world via science and materialism. And in fact, what a lot is going on with Hegel is he's reacting against these German romantics. These German romantics looked at the Enlightenment and said, humans are more than just living machines. So we have a guy named Max Weber who wrote an important piece of work in the history of sociology called The Disenchantment of the World. So Weber argues that the gods are gone. The gods of the Grecian world are over. And even the great dictating God that controls everything of Christianity is gone. We just have mechanical principles in the material world that we live. Now, he didn't reject God per se. And there is one thing to note is that when the Enlightenment happens, the type of Christianity that becomes very prominent is deism. What is deism? Deism is, it's often called the watchmaker principle. It's the belief that there is a God, he created the world, and then he walked away with it. He walked away from it. He's not controlling it. He's not immanent in any way. God created the world, we're just in it. The world operates mechanically. There can be gods, there can be angels, but they're not important. Now, another argument could be a lot of this comes out of Protestantism. That's why I selected this picture here. You have Martin Luther pounding his propositions onto the doorposts in Germany and arguing that we need to reject the authority of the Pope. We need to study scripture on our own. We need to accept that humans have free will and there is no intercession between man and God. Man can directly go to God and get his salvation. And a part of that is a rejection of ritual, a rejection of tradition, and an emphasis on the individual and the individual interpretation of religion. What does that sound like? It sounds like a lot how we think, say, as Americans. We see ourselves as these sort of hermetic individuals who just operate out of our own wills, uninfluenced by anything else. The solitary genius within me does the Dr. Ulrich thing. So Weber argues for the disenchantment of the world, but that gets me wondering, was the world all that disenchanted? I mean, what type of thoughts characterize this post-enlightenment world? So these days, is our world still so disenchanted? I mean, I meet an awful lot of people that are interested in ghosts and aliens and cryptids and whatnot, and even in just that's something. But then you really think about it, and there's an awful lot of people who talk about psychic powers. I would say that the world has never been as disenchanted as Weber would like to say, and that some of us who have not been so pleased with the disenchantment of the world have gone carrying on in a very enchanted space. So there's a concept now that I hear people talk about that is the re-enchantment of the world. How can we bring religion back to the world? How can we bring spirituality back to our daily lives? Now, do I think that's a terribly good thing? I don't know. Am I interested in ghosts and spirits and animism and aliens and whatnot? Absolutely. And if that's the re-enchantment of the world, I'm all for it. Though I don't think the world ever got completely disenchanted. So when I say enlightenment, I wanted to reiterate this. I don't mean liberation or freedom, which is why I don't like to use the word enlightenment. You'll notice when I'm talking about Hinduism, Buddhism, I often talk about liberation. I don't talk about enlightenment because I don't want this confusion. And the Enlightenment also presages sort of the coming of modernism in the 20th century, which picks up a lot of these same arguments. And the Romantics, of course, are people that saw this Enlightenment, specifically these German Romantics we're going to talk briefly about today. And I thought, absolutely not. Let's look back in time to the glories of the past, to the glories of emotion, and to the glories of the East. And Hegel said, no, thank you, because Hegel was a super Enlightenment modernist. Why am I going through all of this? What does this have to do with yoga? Well, lots of it. It's all connected. This class is a social history. It shows a story of Eastern thoughts and Western thoughts. It shows how they're all connected. And part of having a liberal arts education in this class is very much a part of the liberal arts, even the humanistic arts, is to see the vast connections, the huge trajectory of consciousness over time. So it's perfectly acceptable to think about Plato, to think about Shankaracharya, to think about Patanjali, to think about Hegel, to think about Madame Blavatsky, the occultists, who we're going to talk about today. All these are together gathered in this history of human consciousness. And the more that you're learning about these wide swaths of thought, be they from ancient India to 20th century Burbank, the more you learn about thought, the more you'll see how human consciousness is intermingled, is all connected. I know there's a philosophical there's an aphorism according to an occultist who says, if you look long enough at anything, you'll see everything. And so much of this class in yoga is if you look long enough at yoga and how it creeps out in all these directions, it connects to everything else, including our Western intellectual history. Speaking of Western intellectual history, here he is, the mighty Hegel. I will admit, I didn't read Hegel until I got to graduate school. And I had a professor who did a long series of lectures on Hegel. And he used to joke that every time he got out of Hegel, despite being a scholar of Heidegger, it's beside the point, he was always pulled back in, that Hegel had a compelling argument. I would argue that Hegel even has a sort of master narrative for understanding the West. Well, what does Hegel have to do with yoga? Well, we do know that Hegel read Colebrooke's study of the Bhagavad Gita and the Yogasutras. So he had a familiarity with both of these texts. But he himself was not a Sanskrit thinker. And he regarded India as really interesting. And in his later life, he posited that there could be an actual philosophy in India, but he rejected it earlier, saying that philosophy was always connected to religion in India, and therefore it couldn't be proper philosophy. So he was one of the most important thinkers in the 20th in continental thought. I mean, some people say all philosophy is, a commentary or footnote on Plato. And I would argue that all contemporary thought is kind of a commentary and footnote on Hegel. I think about Hegel a lot. I come back to Hegel a lot. All right. I've got spicy Indian tea today. It's very exciting, but it makes my mouth burn, so I need a little water. Garam chai, spicy chai. Okay. You ever hear the adage, it's tea if by sea and cha if by land? So it's chai in India because in India they had tea. In Thailand, it's cha. In China, it's cha. In Buddha's and Tibet, it's cha. But it's tea if by sea. So the British met tea in India, and they called it tea. We got tea in the United States, by sea, so it's tea. There you go. Tea if by sea, cha if by land. See a little footnote on tea. So anyway, Hegel is this kind of systematic thinker. He's trying to make a grand unified theory. Remember I talked about how so much of like Indian philosophy is a grand unified theory? Well, here's another one. So Hegel argues, and I don't expect you to get all this, but get it in your head when you encounter Hegel later in other classes in your reading and whatnot, it'll be useful. Hegel had this idea that history was a process in which the world spirit, or the spirit of humanity, which he calls Geist, which means ghost, moves from being unconscious and in potential to conscious and realized, and it can realize itself. How does spirit or human consciousness, this great world spirit, zeitgeist, how does it reveal itself? How does it become conscious? How does humanity become conscious of its full potential? He argues that this happens through national Volksgeist, Volk meaning folk, Geist meaning ghosts, so spirits of the people. So in the ways that great men in great cultures realize rationality, science, fulfillment of themselves, full consciousness and realization of the human spirit. In fact, being him, he says that the world spirit awakened with ancient Greece, not ancient India, with ancient Greece, starting with, Plato and Socrates, and it reached its full fulfillment in the 19th century Germany. Yeah, what are you going to do? He was a 19th century German. So the universe and the world spirit in its full fulfillment is capitalist, rational, realizes the power and truth of the individual, sees humanity and humanism as an inherently good thing. And there's an argument that once this world spirit fully realizes itself, then it will be the end of history. There will be no history. Nothing new will happen because it'll be fully realized and we'll just move on forever, fully realized within ourselves as human beings. So he talks about the end of history in this. So the universal human world spirit realizes itself in the spirit of nations, or in the specific of a specific nation, aka Germany, that develops to cultural perfection. So Hegel will argue that cultural height is Germany. And another professor would say that, a lot of Americans kind of think in a Hegelian way. So the East, what do we do with, Singapore? Well, once we get them to be Christians and get them to be capitalists, then they'll just naturally unfold and be just like us. You can see this. I remember first going to India and I had a thought like this. I'm like, oh, as India is a developing country, I assume it'll develop just like we did in the West. They'll be just like us in time, just, with different color skin and some slightly different religions. But for Hegel, the height of the world spirit is capitalism and Christianity. And he saw Christianity as being the perfect encapsulation of the individual and the divine. That's another whole ballgame. He has a thing called the dialectic to explain his philosophy. And that's when he takes two opposites and shows how they connect. So there is man and there is God, right? Completely separate. But in Christ, you have God and man at the same time, which allows God to realize the truth of humanity and humanity to realize the truth of God and bring them together. That's a Hegelian dialectic. Again, I know it's a lot. I just wanted to give it to you. So once those two opposites are unified, say man and God in Christ, then the world spirit can move forward. And so Hegel sees all of these contradictions in the world and tries to show dialectically how they can be resolved. Now, Hegel he was particularly critical of German romantics who rejected the Enlightenment. He saw the Enlightenment as the revealing of the human spirit. So romantics were a little different. They sort of looked to nature and art. They didn't look to the individual in the same way, or rationality. They sought to re-enchant the world. But they mostly wanted to hold on to ideals. And in reality, unlike Hegel, some of these romantics actually learned Sanskrit, but Hegel never did. So for Hegel, there can be no philosophy outside of the West. So really philosophy is Western. So there can be no philosophy in India, let alone a philosophy of yoga or philosophy of Sankhya, which he was familiar with both of them. So he read the Gita, and then later in life, he read the Yogasutras, and he dismissed the Yogasutras initially because there was all this stuff with yogi powers. And he's like, you can't separate religion and philosophy. And if you can't get the religion out of the philosophy, despite the fact that he was constantly putting Christianity into his own philosophy, if you can't get the religion out of the philosophy, then it's not real proper philosophy. So Hegel makes an attack on yoga, which allows him to attack the other German romantics who quite like it. He writes, and White writes this on page 86, for as Humboldt and Schlegel had translated yoga as absorption and devotion or preference of perseverance, respectively, Hegel took a different position. And that position stated, one second. Sorry, I didn't have this all set out. Yes. So Hegel took the position that the term yoga, in fact, was untranslatable. He said, our German language cannot possess a word which corresponds to such a determination because the thing cannot be found in our culture and religion. Later, however, he would come around to proposing his own translation, which was yoga as abstract devotion. So Hegel wrote about yoga, but he went back and forth, and he really was trying to work out his own argument and kind of missed the forest for the trees. But, you know, a lot of people miss the forest for all the trees. So what's the deal with Hegel? So Hegel continues to argue that there is no Indian philosophy outside of a rational and superstitious religion. And remember, his whole thing is world spirit is rational. World spirit is, not superstitious. The world spirit fully resolves itself through a dead guy coming back to life because he's the son of God. But that's beside the point. Okay, so he's especially critical of the third chapter of the Yogasutras, just like everybody seems to be, even though that's my favorite chapter. So Hegel is yet another scholar thinker who rejects the philosophy of the Yogasutras because it overlaps with the practices of yogis and the superstitions that we also find. And what is a superstition? It's a technology for being in the world. That's not so rational. Ooh, heaven forbid. Okay, so this is problematic. So he rejects the Yogasutras because it's associated with stuff yogis do. But we saw that the yogis at this time weren't using the Yogasutras. And he is unable to separate out parts of the Yogasutras. So he later recognizes that, especially with Sankhya, there is a sophisticated philosophy, but he doesn't see it as a national philosophy or a world philosophy or a philosophy that forwards his project of fulfilling the world spirit. So toward the end of his life, he wrote his 1829 to 1930 lectures on the history of philosophy, and he has one on a long section on religion that's fascinating. And Hegel returned to the Yogasutras and argued that in samadhi, remember that ending level of the 8 limbs, here abstraction or spiritual isolation is a proper philosophy. So he comes to that at the end of his life. What are you going to do with it? So despite all of the influence of Hegel's ideas on Indian philosophy, and I sure know a lot of Indian philosophers, contemporary Indian philosophers, who look at Hegel. His dismissal still looms large, but he only used Colebrooke. He never learned Sanskrit himself. He critiqued people who barely knew anything about Indian philosophy themselves. So Hegel, in many ways, is yet another line of dilettantes who have come in and proposed that they perfectly understand yoga without being able to read the language, going to India, or talking to anybody that does any of that stuff. Which brings us to somebody who knows a little bit better. Rajendralal Mitra. So this guy sort of was looking around, and he saw that there were some English translations, some partial translations, that were published in 1852. Now, in 1883, he brought out his own translation of the Yoga Sutra. And it's long out of print. However, David White was able to find a copy of it, and he writes a summary that I'm going to go through with you in just a second. Intriguingly, I went and looked, and this book by Mitra, which you used to not be able to get, and White got a microfilm. If you've ever read a book on microfilm, it's a pain. So White gets the text, he writes this summary, and he goes, wow, this is clearer than Patanjali. This is like the clearest commentary on the aphorisms of Patanjali I've ever read. And this thing's been out of print for a really long time. Intriguingly, I've noticed in like yoga forums online and whatnot, people are like, oh, can you get that Mitra, that text that White talks about in this book? Because actually our little book here is actually well read by quite a lot of contemporary yoga practitioners. I was surprised. I continue to be surprised by how many students of yoga and non-professional scholars read that book. So anyway, it's quite good. Now, Mitra's an interesting guy. He was the librarian at the Asiatic Society of Bengal. He was an Indian guy, of course, but he was very much in line with the British colonial government. Now, the Asiatic Society of Bengal, and I've got you a picture right there, is still going. In fact, it's a wonderful place to go and read Sanskrit manuscripts. I've spent a lot of time there. Well, I always get sick because of the chemicals they use to preserve the text, and it's very hard to get photocopies of anything, but you can go and just read. It also has a lovely museum. It's there in Calcutta. It's worth going to. All right. So this is Rajendralal Mitra's exposition on the Yogasutras, and I'm just going to talk it through with you. Now, remember what we read. Remember we read the translations of the Yogasutras by not only Bryant, but by Stoller Miller. So Mitra does something different. He doesn't just give a translation. He gives a translation, but he messes around the word orders. And in fact, when you look at like other Indologists and Indian philosophers who've looked at the Yoga Sutras, they're like, none of this makes it can't make sense in the way it's ordered. Why is it ordered this way? I've always wondered if maybe it got ordered funny over the years of the text being copied. It just doesn't seem like a coherent way to write a text. Even Bryant, in his big book on Yoga Sutras that we've read out of, look at this bad monster. It's a big book. So even Bryant, he sticks with the order of the sutras, of the Yoga Sutras in Patanjali. All right, so here's where it gets interesting. All right, now, we're once again going to the content of the Yoga Sutras. Get ready, get set, Sankhya, here we go. All right, first off, first proposition. There is no God. There is a God. We have the word, his God is called Yogeshwara, the Lord of Yoga. His syllable is Om, the primordial sound of the universe. If you listen, that's all of the vowel sounds. So you get the thought is that you stimulate every part of your throat from the back all the way to the front. And in this way, you can make all of the sounds possible in the Sanskrit language. So Om is the ever resonating sound of the universe and the sound of God. And it says in the Yoga Sutras that if you want to realize the God Yogeshwara, the Lord of Yoga, you just think Om, 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 Om. Your whole brain's going Om all the time. Okay, so there is a God. He did not create the world, but he'll help you get liberation from suffering. Souls. There's lots of souls. Remember Sankhya. These are Purushas. There's lots of souls. There's innumerable souls. There's many, many souls. Now, the universe is uncreated. It is Prakriti. It has always been there. It'll always be there. And it's made up of those three gunas, Sattva, Raja, Tamas. Okay, so there's a God. He didn't create the world, but he's in the world and he'll help you out in yoga. There are many souls. There are Purushas that are experiencing Prakriti and can get confused. All right, come on, next one. Okay, so chitta, thought or consciousness or awareness, is the thinking principle, and it relates movements of Prakriti to Purusha, but it is itself Purusha. So you do have chitta, vritti, yogash chitta vritti narodha. So chitta is like a pure awareness. It is luminous, contentless, pure. It is Purusha. But it sees the movements of Prakriti, and it identifies with the sense objects that go out and contact Prakriti, move, and come back. So you have a thinking principle, which has processes like right notion, misconception, fancy, sleep, memory. These are processes that go on in your head. But those are actually Prakriti too. Those are nature. And your awareness, your Purusha, is not even really touching them, but is experiencing them. There are lots of changes to the world. Everything around us is always in flux. The gunas are always circulating, but Prakriti is never destroyed. Now, Prakriti is real. It's a real thing. The world is real. It's not an illusion. It's an illusion to become convinced that you are stuck in Prakriti, or to be convinced that Prakriti is Purusha. Now, your mind takes sensory perceptions and relates it back to the individual. Prakriti's here. Awareness is here. Between the world out there, there's the subtle Prakriti, which is your mind, which Purusha thinks it is, but it isn't. The mind perceives the Prakriti, and that influences the ignorant soul. The soul gets the stupid idea that it is the world out there, but it is not. It is just Purusha. It is pure, light, and luminous. The thinking principle creates sanskaras, or karmic traces that influence the trajectory of the soul. This means that in your head, as you're reacting to things, you're creating tendencies. These are the samskaras. These are the things that propel your consciousness into other lives. While you're doing this, you have desires, and desires create pain. Why? Because Prakriti is always in flux, and there will always be pain and impermanence. Think about Buddhism there. But Purusha is self-luminous. Purusha is perfect. Once Purusha knows what itself truly is, then it's as if it's watching a stage show and Prakriti dances off and the stage is empty. So there's no beginning to these samskaras. So your karmic traces. The world is uncreated, so there have always been these karmic traces, and you've always been here. You as a Purusha have always been here. So there's no beginning of this. So mundane existence is painful. We realize pain. We realize we are dissatisfied in the world. And the goal of life is to avoid pain, to avoid discomfort. So how can you get rid of pain and discomfort? Well, pain is overwhelmed by removing thought from senses, by removing Purusha from Prakriti. How do you do that? The 8 limbs of yoga. Remember, that's in the Purusha, that's in the Yogasutras. The yamas and the niyamas, the do's and the don'ts. The asanas, the body positions. Make your position firm and comfortable. Pranayama, exercising the breath, moving the breath around and breathing. Pratyahara, withdrawing from sensory principles. Dharana, focusing the mind on specific things that are good. Dhyana, meditation, when the mind only is doing one thing. And samadhi, that transcendence, when you even transcend the mind. Finally, when you remove the contact of Purusha and Prakriti, that creates occult powers. In fact, in Pratyahara, withdrawal, when you're removing your senses, at that point, you will begin to experience the occult powers, because when you're withdrawing the senses from the sense objects, you'll understand your senses in and of themselves. And when you understand them in and of themselves, they can manipulate Prakriti. They can manipulate the gunas. You can send the sense objects, now that you know that you're not just them, you can control them and do things with them. Complete withdrawal from all of exterior sense objects and complete focus in the Purusha, realization of the Purusha, leads to liberation. And I gave you a picture of the Buddha getting liberated here because it's just the best picture of people getting liberated. Okay, so that was Rajendralal Mitra. And what I want you to think about is, was that exposition pretty simple? I mean, you heard me talk through the contents of the Yogasutras a bunch of times, but that's a pretty clear way to go about it. One must wonder why Patanjali couldn't have been clear like that, or why Vyasa didn't move these texts around. But remember the nature of a sutra. They're very short. There are only like 4 verbs in the whole thing. And the idea is they're used as like mnemonic devices. You'll memorize the sutras, and then you'll chant them out, and then you'll read a commentary on it, or you'll make your own exposition on it. So the sutras aren't meant to be a coherent, logical argument, as that's more like commentaries. They're meant to be more of like a mnemonic device so you can memorize all of the contents. Okay, so the last part of today is we're going to talk about the Theosophical Society that we already started talking about a little bit. So the Theosophical Society was founded in the 18th century. They're still going. They're much smaller now. You can see the symbol over here. There is no religion higher than truth, but even if you look at it, you can see an ankh, which is a symbol for eternity. You can see that's probably a nutty swastika. And remember that swastikas go back long before Nazis. We find them in Jainism very early in like 500 BCE in India. That top symbol is actually an Om. They're written in a very specific way. We see triangles up, triangles down, Stars of David, crosses, a sun, a snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. All the symbols for all mystic religions are kind of in there. They had lodges all over the world. There's still a bunch of them. There used to be one by my house in California. Their location in India, the Theosophical Society, is one of the nicest places I tended to stay in India. They also have a great library there. I love going there. But they were very much they had a theory that human consciousness and humanity, if purified through religion and expanded through religion and through the truth, which can be found in the secret lore found throughout the world, it's kind of Hegelian in its own, that human consciousness will expand And then we will come to a newer age, a new eon in which humans can realize themselves and find the truth constantly. But where does this come from? This is interesting. So the Theosophical Society was founded in New York in 1875, and it would later relocate to India. So the thing is that the Theosophical Society maintained a strong following throughout the United States. They're not that big now, but they are still around. So the aims of the Theosophical Society were to further both spiritualism and occult sciences. But what is spiritualism? And when you're writing for the rest of your life, never use the word spiritualism unless you're talking about what I'm just going to talk about. Spiritualism is seances. What's a seance? Seance means sitting down. It's a French word that means sitting down. So there were the Fox sisters in upstate New York, and they started having all sorts of ghostly phenomena happening. And they created this system where people would sit in the dark, and they would kind of hold their hands. They might even have a crystal ball, and they would contact disembodied spirits. Whether those disembodied spirits are ghosts, and the majority of the disembodied spirits they were trying to contact were ghosts, but a bigger deal for them theoretically, because really parlor tricks of ghosts and whatnot were really their big thing, was to contact disembodied masters, evolved spirits that are non-physical, that want to contact us, and through mediumship or channeling, one is able to contact these spirits, be it whether it's one of these seances where someone goes into a trance and speaks as if they're, your dead Aunt Grace, or if someone in that spirit says, I am Rahut Kamini, and begins speaking fantastic truths, the mystic truth from across the times and space. Either way, spiritualism. So the occult sciences, so sciences of the occult, and occult, remember, means secret. So the occult sciences aim at the transformation of man through the teachings of the masters. Who are these masters? These disembodied masters. Sometimes they're even called the Great White Brothers. So yeah, don't tell the Aryan Nation too much about that. And that's a whole other ballgame. Never mind. So yeah, that word Aryan is always interesting to me. Aryan is a Sanskrit word meaning pure or holy or worthy one. And then it gets through racist science to become like the noble, white, glorious people. But when we talk about Aryan languages, we're generally talking about like Persian and Sanskrit and Greek. We're not talking about Teutonic languages. Anyway, so we'll just do that to the side. So unless you're talking about people conjuring up spirits of the dead, it's not spiritualism. So don't use the word spirituality and spiritualism in the same way. And also while you're on it, don't use the word spirituality. The word doesn't mean anything. It's a throwaway word, unless you can get a good definition of it in your papers. Okay, so spirits may be of dead, but it's mostly of disembodied figures. These creatures and these figures are rarely hostile, unlike what we see in horror movie depictions of seances. So they do a seance, they talk to your Aunt Mary, she comes through, but rarely hostile. Disembodied spirit of the Great White Brotherhood come through and speak, neither hostile. So we kind of think of seances as being sort of like scary things, but in reality, they weren't all that scary. Generally, the people that they would interact with would be, well, the entities would be quite benevolent. Now, spiritualism was a raging thing all across the United States, up and probably to like the 30s or 40s, to the point that pretty much everybody was doing these seances. Well, not everybody, but the upper class, upper crust whitey folks definitely were all up to this business. Now, they were a little nutty, so they had an interesting idea called ectoplasm. You may have heard that from the Ghostbusters movies, but it's not what you'd think. The idea is that these disembodied spirits can become formed in the world in this sort of vaporous, ethereal presences, like this picture of this dude with the face up to the right. So they would have these encounters with ghosts that could materialize. And there's great photos of this. And like people would belch this like smoky plasm out of their mouths, or they would form above their head. But the idea was that this ectoplasm could be released, and it was like spirits physically interacting. But the minute that the person that releases the ectoplasm comes out of the trance, then it's all gone. In fact, I was at a lecture recently, and somebody showed these photographs where this occultist had managed, who was very good at conjuring spirits and creating ectoplasmic things was often seeing hands, and people in the seances would see hands. And he found a very subtle wax and found that the spirits would touch this very subtle wax and they would have impressions. And it's one of these few sort of traces we have of spirits interacting with the world. I go back and forth on it. Okay, so originally, Madame Blavatsky argued that her work, her most important work, Isis Unveiled, was channeled from the Himalayan masters, often the Himalayan masters of Tibet. Now, her work was denounced because a bunch of people looked at it like, you're plagiarizing. So White notes that her Himalayan masters were clearly reading the same books that she read, since they delivered the exact same messages. So I guess the ghosts were the plagiarists in the first place. Ghost plagiarists. So she had this idea, like there were all of these disembodied masters that can be represented by sort of the highest entities in all of the religions, and we can contact them and they'll give you the highest truth, this highest truth that is absolutely identical to all of her teachings on psychic powers and whatnot. Go figure. Okay. Come on. So Blavatsky kind of got run out of the United States because people are like, you are plagiarizing everything. You're saying you're channeling it from these Himalayan masters, but you're clearly just writing this darn book. So she and her group went to India. In particular, they went to South India, what is now Chennai, and was back then called Madras. And just outside of town, they established a town called Besant Nagar after a woman named Annie Besant, who I'll talk about later. So she began to receive these incredible letters from the Mahatmas, and they were thought to be these hidden spirits of Kuthumi and Master Morya. These were also declared to be frauds. They were also supposed to be Indians or Tibetans, but those names don't sound right for an Indian or Tibetan. So she leaves in 85 and publishes The Secret Doctrine, which becomes her most famous work after Isis Unveiled. So these masters at some point were said to come from India, but the minute she got to India, she suddenly said they came from Tibet. I suppose it just got too easy to actually hang around with Indians and see people actually, talking about Indian religions. You will notice that whenever folk want to make something really obscure or precious, they put it in Tibet. Now, I speak a little Tibetan, and I've hung out with Tibetan people. I haven't been to Tibet, but I'll tell you, Tibetans are great. Tibetan culture is wonderful. That's not the be-all, end-all of human consciousness and culture. It's just yet another lovely culture to interact with. So, via the Theosophical Society, several early and not so good translations of the Yogasutras were published. But these were popular, and they made it into more hands than just scholars. So the Yogasutras ended up becoming prominent, and especially using the translations that they put out in the 20th century. The other thing to note about the Theosophical Society in Besant Nagar is they were very active in resisting the British. So for all of the kookiness of these people, they were anti-colonial and anti-clerical. I don't care if they were anti-clerical, but they were anti-colonial. They looked at Britain and the way Britain was handling India and said, this is some BS. And while in India, we're like, no, this is stupid. So they really did support the India freedom movement. So Blavatsky rejected Hatha Yoga, as everybody seems to do. And why did she reject Hatha Yoga? Because she saw yogis practicing this Hatha Yoga, and they were shysters and criminals or whatnot. Now, she also posited a type of yoga called Raja Yoga, the kingly way, that is described as a way of meditation, as opposed to Hatha Yoga, which is just a way of bodily practice. Either way, Hatha yogis in India do a lot of meditation. And this notion of Raja Yoga, we have a few texts on, but it wasn't a big deal. But it sure comes to be a big deal when we come to Swami Vivekananda, who we're going to talk about in the next lecture, who actually wrote a translation of the Yogasutras, a loose translation of the Yogasutras, and called it Raja Yoga, and effectively made Raja Yoga the thing everyone's aspiring to do. So one thing that I was really thinking about as I was reading this today is, why does everybody want to dismiss the yogis? I mean, they have a social reason because they're kind of sketchy. They do stuff that people find upsetting. Some of them were mercenaries, many of them were criminals. But there's also this inherent enlightenment level rejection of the body over the mind. If you see people doing practices that develop their souls that are purely physical, and you believe in rationality and the rejection of ritual, it's also rejection of the body. So I think another of these critiques of yogis isn't just that they were criminals and mercenaries, or they're doing extreme bodily things that people didn't like. It's that they were locating the body as a means for spiritual development. And by this point, after the Enlightenment, we're supposed to be only head, nothing below the head, only head, all rational. So an interesting interpretation that Blavatsky argued was, in fact, based on something else. I know everything's based on something. That's how I roll in this class. Everything's based on something, and that is mesmerism. Have you ever heard of mesmerism? Mesmerism becomes hypnotism. Early hypnotism was called mesmerism. You'll hear about someone being referred to as being mesmerized, being captivated by looking at someone. Well, there was a guy named Mesmer, and he posited this thing called mesmerism. Mesmerism argues that there is an ether, an astral light, a magnetic fluid, ectoplasm, that permeates the entire universe. There's this energy around, and the closest that we can see to it is physical magnetism, when you take a magnet and you hold it to a metal thing and they attract. And he said it's like there's that, but it's spiritual and it's everywhere. So this isn't physical mesmerism, which is putting people into a trance per se, and it's not physical magnetism as in magnets and iron filings. What we're talking about is human beings, mesmerists, are able to activate and manipulate this magnetic energy in their body and to zap other people. And there's all these accounts you can read of someone using their mesmeric powers, their powers of magnetism, to magnetize others. So it'll be somebody comes in like, I can't sleep. Like, let me magnetize you. Then you're magnetized by his magical powers, and then you can sleep or your illnesses go away. So there's all this stuff written about mesmerism. It was a huge deal that we don't think about now. And that's my whole thing, is think about stuff we don't think about now. But when I think about mesmerism, I think about Reiki. So I've known a lot of Reiki practitioners, and they have various symbols that are revealed to them through initiations that allow them to manipulate what they see as light. They can lay over a body and to balance energy channels, or even I've heard of people fixing cars with their hands of light and whatnot. This is very much mesmerism 2.0 in the late 20th century. So this is definitely attached to what we hear of as Reiki. We also have an idea of animal magnetism. You hear somebody say, oh, that guy has an animal magnetism. Women are unable to resist him. That's that magnetism again. Someone having such personal charisma that they're thought to compel other human beings through their almost inherent magnetic power to attract people to them, and animal magnetism. But what's really going on here is folks who have psychic might using their powers magnetically to alter the world and alter other people through a mental and supernatural power. So occultism, remember, is the secret. It means what is occluded. So it is mesmerism, but it's revealing these secrets of the universe, that there is this magnetic fluid everywhere, and some people can manipulate it. Maybe you can too, for only $19.95. Okay, so I think a great analog to this is that ectoplasm stuff that that we saw in spiritualism, that people would be able to emanate out this spiritual energy that when they come out of the trance or the lights pop on is just gone. Again, subtle fluids and energies. All right, so back to the Theosophical Society. So Annie Besant succeeded Blavatsky in India in 1893. Now, under Besant, the Theosophical Society became increasingly aligned with the Indian independence movement. Yoga, in fact, they would argue, was thought to be an early indigenous science that should be promoted as a jewel in Indian civilization. Not yogis, but yoga. Even in 1916, she founded Banaras Hindu University, which is still the premier, one of the premier places of learning in India. So Besant wrote a book in 1927. So we're all the way back we're in the 20s now, and this is actually kind of right around the time that Swami Vivekananda is writing. And she writes a quote, and she says, she's talking about the Yogasutras. The other part of the yoga literature is a small book called the Sutras of Patanjali, our Yogasutras. That is available, but I'm afraid that few are able to make much of it themselves. In the first place, to elucidate the sutra, which is simply headings, there is a great deal of commentary in Sanskrit, only partially translated. And even the commentaries have this peculiarity that even all of the most difficult words are merely repeated, not explained, so that the student is not much enlightened. So that's not a great take on the Yoga Sutras in general. She admits that there is a commentarial and a lived tradition, but she can't find a lived tradition of people actually doing the yoga of the Yoga Sutras. We'll see that later theosophists would describe various types of yogas, and they would describe the Yoga Sutras as being a Raja Yoga scripture, even though the term Raja Yoga doesn't really come up in this context in the way that they're going to describe it. Now, they would argue that Raja Yoga, which means the kingly yoga, is the highest form of yoga that should be contrasted with Hatha Yoga and other things like Laya Yoga, which is pranayama and kundalini, bhakti and mantra. Now, Blavatsky never really connected the Raja Yoga to the Yoga Sutras. She, in fact, when she was writing, when we talk about about Raja Yoga, she would connect it to Hatha Yoga. She argued that there were a group of Dundans, or spiritual, these are high caste spiritual renunciates in India, who were Advaita Vedanta people. She says that they're teaching Raja Yoga, but it's hard pressed they actually were. Raja Yoga was a term before the 19th century, but it was never a major school of yoga. There is evidence of Raja Yoga, the kingly yoga, being thought of to be the culmination of Hatha, and that Hatha was thought as a preliminary. I don't ever think it was really widespread, but we're finding more and more information right now, and it's an exciting time to study Raja Yoga. So Blavatsky's kind of odd because she actually had these connections to a number of doctors who were interested in yoga. There's a guy named N.C. Paul, and he wrote a book called A Treatise on the Yoga Philosophy. Here he dismisses Hatha Yoga and, in fact, all of the contents of the Yoga Sutras. He, in fact, ignores yoga philosophy and scriptures. He writes about the healthful qualities of yoga techniques and documents the practices of yogis, but he does this from a medical perspective. So suddenly there's an Indian theosophist who believes that yoga is for health. We also have a character named Swami Dayananda Saraswati, who knew all these people. He ended up forming a group called the Arya Samaj. I can leave that aside. He was a medical doctor and a skeptic. He went for 9 years looking for a yogi that could teach him the truth of the Yoga Sutras or a system of yoga, and he couldn't find them. So in other words, he had this idea like there has to be this thing called yoga, and he looks at the Bhagavad Gita, and Krishna is all over the place talking about yoga. He's like, I gotta find people that are doing yoga, and he finds Hatha yogis. They don't do anything for him. And he finds a couple of people that might have heard of scriptures on yoga, but didn't know anything about it. He was also a medical doctor. So when he was looking at Tantra, has a lot to do with like chakras in the body. That's chakra, not chakra, energy wheels. And he said he did an autopsy of a guy and he looked inside and he couldn't find any chakras. He couldn't find any energy channels. He said, so they must not exist. He actually created an organization that's sort of a nouveau neo-Hinduism that's very much Hinduism in English and Hindi, with a very simplified ritual system that's sort of outside of a lot of the going out against superstition. Again, I'm pro-superstition, but that's me. Okay, so Hatha and Raja Yoga. What are they? Hatha Yoga means the violent exertion. Raja Yoga means the kingly exertion. You can look to the work if you want to understand Hatha and Raja Yoga. There's an excellent scholar named Jason Birch. His stuff is available and he's an old buddy of mine. That is very good, but it's very heavy and philological. Talking a lot about Sanskrit words and meanings, which is probably a little bit too much for all y'all. But he's uncovered a type of yoga called the Amanaska Yoga, which means a yoga where the mind is completely dissolved. That is called a Raja Yoga in the text he's looking at. And in fact, the Raja Yoga says that Hatha is a preliminary to Raja. Thus, even this Raja Yoga can't be separated from Hatha. Despite all these different versions of Raja Yoga that we're about to see get really started with the great one, Swami V. Swami Vivekananda comes next. So our next lecture is going to be on Swami Vivekananda. He's one of my favorite guys of all time. He died quite young. He was the devotee of a charismatic tantric bhakta named Ramakrishna, and he went on to found a giant order that has swamis to this day. He founded the Vedanta centers that are found. There's a bunch of them in the United States. He lived in India, but he came to the US on 4 different times, and he stayed for long periods of time. He had 2 agendas. One, to bring a very scientific version of Hinduism and yoga to the West, but also from his trips to the West to build networks of money and support to support India. He was an Indian nationalist who wanted the British out. He was not a Hindu fundamentalist. He wanted to get the West to learn from the East, to learn from Indian spirituality, and through that, to have the West aid India in developing and to aid in social, charitable organizations in India. So he founded these things called the Ramakrishna, it looks like math and mission, Mutt and mission. Mutt meaning monastery, and mission as in a mission to help people. So we are going to see the great Swami Vivekananda, who in many ways was the first Hindu that any Americans ever met when he spoke at the World Parliamentary Religions in the late 19th century. We will see you next time. Get ready for some Swami V. Bye, y'all.